My stepmom at Dad's funeral whispered, "Finally those ungrateful kids get nothing," but she had no idea what was coming. My stepmother thought she'd won the lottery when Dad died. The mansion in Beverly Hills, the construction empire, his $4.2 million fortune, all of it, she believed, was finally hers. At his funeral, as mourners filed past his casket, she leaned close to her sister and whispered with barely contained glee, "Finally, those ungrateful brats get nothing." What Carmen didn't know was that Dad had quietly moved every asset into our names 3 years earlier. And I'd been recording every conversation since his lung cancer diagnosis. My name is Isabella Sterling, and I'm a 34-year-old corporate attorney practicing in Los Angeles. My father, Richard Sterling, built Sterling Construction from a single pickup truck into one of California's most successful contracting companies. When my mother, Grace, lost her battle with ovarian cancer 8 years ago, Dad was shattered. We all were. For 3 long years, Dad grieved alone in that big house in Beverly Hills. Then he met Carmen Rodriguez at a cancer research fundraiser. She was 41, recently divorced, and everything my elegant mother wasn't: flashy, loud, and obsessed with designer labels. Within 8 months, they were married in a lavish ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. The change in Dad was immediate and disturbing. Carmen systematically began cutting us out of his life. Our weekly family dinners became monthly, then quarterly. Business meetings that once included his children were suddenly too stressful for Dad to discuss at home. Carmen would hover during our visits like a hawk protecting her territory, steering every conversation away from anything meaningful. "Your father's worked hard enough," she'd say with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "He deserves to enjoy retirement without all this business drama weighing him down." My siblings felt the freeze too. Amanda, my 31-year-old sister who managed Dad's financial operations, found herself gradually excluded from budget meetings. Marcus, 28, who'd been Dad's right-hand man on construction sites since college, suddenly had every decision questioned and second-guessed. But we respected Dad's choice. Carmen made him laugh again after years of grief. If this was what he needed to heal, we'd support it, even if it hurt to watch him drift away from us. Everything changed when Dad collapsed on a job site in February 2022. The emergency room doctor delivered the devastating news: advanced lung cancer, stage 4. The oncologist gave him 8 to 12 months with aggressive treatment. Carmen's response was swift and calculating. She immediately appointed herself Dad's primary caregiver and began controlling every aspect of his care, including who could visit and when. "The doctors say stress could kill him faster than the cancer," she'd explain whenever we tried to see him. "Too many visitors overwhelm his system." Something felt terribly wrong, but challenging a wife caring for her dying husband seemed heartless. Little did I know, Dad was already 3 steps ahead of all of us, and Carmen's greed was about to become her downfall. Dad had always been fiercely independent, so when Carmen took control of his medical care, we initially trusted his judgment. But as weeks passed, her restrictions became increasingly suspicious and controlling. Family visits were now scheduled through Carmen like appointments with a busy CEO. Business calls were screened and filtered. Even Dad's oldest friends, men he'd known for 30 years, found themselves unable to reach him directly. When they called the house, Carmen would answer with practiced concern, "Richard's having a difficult day. Perhaps you could try again next week." My suspicions crystallized during a visit in April 2022. I was discussing a client case I'd mentioned the previous week when Dad looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I don't remember that conversation," he said, his brow furrowed in concentration. Carmen swooped in immediately. "The chemotherapy affects his short-term memory, Isabella. The doctors warned us this would happen. It's perfectly normal." But Dad's confusion seemed strangely selective. He could recite construction cost estimates from projects 20 years ago, remember every detail about Mom's favorite recipes, and discuss current baseball statistics with perfect clarity. Yet he consistently couldn't recall recent conversations with his children. It was as if someone was controlling the flow of information in both directions, limiting what we could tell him and what he could remember about us. As a litigation attorney, I understood the critical importance of documentation. I began recording every phone call with Dad and Carmen using a legal app that would be admissible in California courts. I also started maintaining detailed logs of our interactions, dates, times, witnesses, and Carmen's exact words. Initially, my recordings revealed nothing obviously criminal. Carmen appeared attentive to Dad's medical needs. His treatments seemed appropriate, and his doctors spoke highly of her dedication. But disturbing patterns began emerging that set off every alarm bell in my legal training. Carmen consistently scheduled our visits during Dad's worst moments, right after chemotherapy sessions when he was nauseated and exhausted, or during peak pain medication hours when he was barely coherent. She would answer questions directed at Dad and frequently correct his responses before he could finish speaking. Most troubling, she began making assumptions about Dad's estate that revealed her true expectations. During family discussions about his care, she'd casually mention her future plans. When your father passes, I'll probably sell the business. It's such a complicated operation for someone without construction experience. The assumption that she would inherit everything was never directly stated but constantly implied. Carmen spoke as if Dad's company, properties, and investments would naturally flow to her as his surviving spouse. She even began making lists of which furniture she'd keep and which pieces she'd donate. But the most chilling moment came during a recorded phone call in June. I was discussing Dad's upcoming surgery when Carmen interrupted. "Isabella, you need to understand that when this is over, your father's affairs will be my responsibility. You children have your own lives to worry about." The coldness in her voice sent ice through my veins. This wasn't grief talking, it was ownership. Carmen wasn't just planning for Dad's death, she was planning for her financial independence. And in her calculations, his children were nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The breakthrough came during an unexpected moment of clarity in July 2022. I was visiting alone. Carmen had gone to her weekly spa appointment, when Dad suddenly seemed more alert than he'd been in months. The fog that usually clouded his eyes had lifted, and he looked around the room carefully before speaking. "Isabella," he said quietly, "we need to have a very important conversation while Carmen's gone." What he told me next changed everything I thought I knew about our family's future. 3 years earlier, in 2019, Dad had established something called the Sterling Family Trust. Working with his longtime attorney, Benjamin Walsh, he transferred every major asset into this irrevocable trust with his 3 children as the sole beneficiaries. The construction company, all real estate holdings, investment accounts, bank accounts, everything of significant value now legally belonged to us. "I knew Carmen married me for money," Dad said with surprising clarity. "I'm not stupid, Isabella. I just wasn't ready to be alone after losing your mother. Carmen gave me companionship when I needed it most, and I thought that was worth something. But I wasn't going to let her destroy what I'd built for my children." The trust had been meticulously planned and legally bulletproof. Dad had executed all documents while in perfect health, with multiple witnesses and psychiatric evaluations confirming his mental competency. Benjamin Walsh held strict instructions not to reveal the trust's existence until after Dad's death. "Carmen thinks she's inheriting a fortune," Dad continued, glancing toward the door. "She has no idea that being my widow comes with a very modest inheritance, the house we share and about $75,000 in personal accounts. Everything else belongs to you, Amanda, and Marcus." I sat in stunned silence as Dad explained his 3-year deception. He'd allowed Carmen to believe she was his primary beneficiary while secretly protecting his children's inheritance. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely in character for the strategic businessman who'd built an empire from nothing. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Dad's expression grew troubled. "Because Carmen's been pressuring me to sign new documents. She says they're updated medical directives, but I recognize legal language when I see it. She's trying to change my will, and I need you to make sure the trust remains protected." This conversation was recorded like all our recent talks, but more importantly, it revealed that Carmen was actively attempting to manipulate Dad's estate planning during his final months. The woman we'd trusted to care for him was systematically trying to steal our inheritance. I immediately contacted Benjamin Walsh to verify everything Dad had told me. The trust was exactly as described, irrevocable, properly executed, and completely legal. Carmen had no knowledge of its existence and no legal claim to any assets it contained. But Walsh also confirmed my darkest fears. "Carmen has been calling my office repeatedly," he said. "She demands to see your father's will and asks detailed questions about his estate planning. She seems to believe she has a right to this information as his wife." Walsh had refused to provide any details, citing attorney-client privilege. But Carmen's persistent inquiries suggested she was planning something significant, and time was running short. Dad had outmaneuvered Carmen before she even knew a game was being played. Now I had to make sure his strategy succeeded. With Dad's revelation fresh in my mind, I escalated my surveillance efforts. Starting in August 2022, I began recording all interactions with Carmen, not just conversations with Dad. California's one-party consent law meant I could legally record any conversation I participated in without the other party's knowledge. What I discovered over the following months was far more sinister than simple greed. It was a calculated conspiracy to defraud a dying man. Carmen spoke completely differently when she thought Dad couldn't hear her. During recorded phone calls with friends, she complained bitterly about dealing with Richard's spoiled children, and expressed open frustration with the pace of his decline. Most revealing were her detailed plans for spending what she believed would be her inheritance. "I've earned every penny of this money," she told her sister during one recorded conversation. 4 years of pretending to love that old man, dealing with his bratty kids, and now watching him waste away. "I deserve to live the life I've always wanted." Another recording captured her discussing Dad's condition with chilling detachment. "Honestly, I just want this to be over. It's taking forever, and I'm exhausted from playing the devoted wife. The sooner he dies, the sooner I can start my real life." These weren't the words of a grieving wife, they were the calculations of someone waiting for a payday. But the most damning evidence came in September, just 2 months before Dad's death. I was visiting when Carmen stepped onto the back patio for what she thought was a private phone call. I was in the kitchen, ostensibly making tea, when her voice carried through the open window. "He's getting suspicious about the documents," she was saying to someone she called Tony. "Keeps asking detailed questions about what he's signing. Maybe we should wait until the morphine dosage increases." A pause as she listened to the response. "I know it's risky, but we're talking about over $4 million here. Worth the risk if we can get him to sign the new will before he dies." Another pause, then, "His kids don't suspect anything. They think I'm just a devoted wife taking care of their father. By the time they figure out what we've done, the money will be long gone." I recorded this entire conversation while standing frozen in the kitchen, my blood running cold. Carmen was actively conspiring with someone to forge a new will while Dad was dying of cancer. This wasn't just greed, it was elder abuse and fraud on a massive scale. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Amanda and Marcus. I played them selected recordings, enough to prove Carmen's true intentions without violating Dad's privacy about the trust he'd established. My siblings were horrified but not entirely surprised. They'd noticed Carmen's increasingly possessive behavior as Dad's condition worsened. "What can we do?" Amanda asked, her voice shaking with anger. As an attorney, I knew our legal options were limited until Carmen actually committed a crime. But we could prepare for whatever she might attempt. I contacted Benjamin Walsh and arranged additional security measures around Dad's estate documents. We also hired a private investigator to research Carmen's background and identify this mysterious Tony. What we discovered painted a terrifying picture of systematic fraud. Carmen had been married twice before, both times to significantly older men with substantial assets. Her first husband had died of a stroke 18 months after their wedding, leaving her his condominium in Miami. Her second husband had divorced her when he discovered she'd been forging his signature on financial documents and stealing from their joint accounts. Tony turned out to be Antonio Flores, a disbarred attorney who specialized in contested estate cases. He'd been sanctioned multiple times by the California State Bar for ethical violations related to will challenges and inheritance fraud. We now understood Carmen's complete strategy. She was working with Flores to challenge Dad's existing will and substitute a fraudulent document that left everything to her. Dad's cancer diagnosis had simply accelerated their timeline. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for Carmen to spring it. Dad passed away peacefully on November 20, 2022, surrounded by his children. Carmen played her role as the grieving widow with Oscar-worthy performance, sobbing dramatically and accepting condolences with practiced grace. She wore an expensive black Chanel suit and held court at the funeral home like royalty. Receiving subjects. The funeral was everything Dad would have wanted, a celebration of his life and legacy. Sterling Construction employees past and present shared stories of his generosity and leadership. Family friends spoke about his devotion to Mom and his pride in his children. The church was packed with people whose lives Dad had touched over his 67 years. Throughout the service, Carmen maintained her facade perfectly. She clutched tissues, dabbed at her eyes at appropriate moments, and spoke movingly about losing the love of her life. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a devoted wife mourning her husband's death. But I was watching her more carefully than anyone else. After the formal service, guests gathered in the fellowship hall for the reception. This was where families shared more intimate memories and friends offered personal condolences. I was adjusting the microphone for a memorial video tribute when I noticed Carmen speaking quietly with her sister Lucia near the back corner of the room. They thought they were far enough away from the crowd to avoid being overheard. They were wrong. I activated the recording app on my phone and moved closer, pretending to arrange floral displays while keeping my device positioned to capture their conversation. Finally, Carmen whispered with barely concealed satisfaction, "Those ungrateful brats get nothing. Richard might have loved them, but I made sure they won't see a penny of his money." Lucia's response was equally revealing. "Are you absolutely sure the new will is legal? What if they hire lawyers to challenge it?" Carmen's smile was cold and confident. "Tony handled everything perfectly. We have witnesses, proper signatures, notarization, the whole process looks completely legitimate. By the time Isabella and her siblings figure out what happened, the money will be safely offshore where they can't touch it." I felt my hands trembling as I recorded every word. Carmen had just confessed to committing fraud at her husband's funeral, surrounded by people mourning the man she'd betrayed. But she wasn't finished. "The best part," Carmen continued, "is that they actually trust me. They think I loved Richard and that I'm devastated by his death. They have no idea I've been planning this for 2 years." Lucia glanced around nervously. "What about his attorney? Won't he know something's wrong?" "Benjamin Walsh will never see the real will," Carmen replied smugly. "Tony's got a duplicate of his letterhead and signature. The document we file with the probate court will look like it came from Walsh's office. By the time anyone realizes it's fake, I'll be living in Costa Rica." I had heard enough. Carmen hadn't just committed fraud, she confessed to an elaborate conspiracy involving forged documents, stolen identities, and planned flight from prosecution. She'd essentially handed me a complete roadmap of her criminal enterprise. As guests began leaving the reception, Carmen transformed back into the grieving widow, thanking everyone for their support and speaking about how much their presence meant during this difficult time. Her performance was flawless, except for the fact that I'd recorded her true feelings about Dad's death. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday. Carmen had no idea she was walking into a trap that Dad had set 3 years earlier, armed with evidence that would destroy any chance of her escaping justice. The next few days would reveal whether Dad's brilliant strategy could overcome Carmen's criminal conspiracy. The will reading took place at Benjamin Walsh's law office in Century City on a gray Thursday morning. Carmen arrived dressed like she was attending a board meeting, designer suit, professional briefcase, and an air of confidence that suggested she expected to take control of Dad's empire within the hour. She brought Antonio Flores as her legal representation, a thin man with slicked back hair who immediately began making demands about seeing all estate documents. "Mrs. Sterling has reason to believe there may be irregularities in her husband's estate planning," Flores announced. "We're prepared to challenge any documents that don't reflect Mr. Sterling's true final wishes." Amanda, Marcus, and I sat quietly in the conference room's leather chairs, saying nothing. Walsh had briefed us on what to expect, but seeing Carmen's arrogant confidence made the moment surreal. She genuinely believed she was about to inherit millions of dollars from the man she'd systematically betrayed. Walsh opened his file with professional calm. "Let's begin with the will first, then review other relevant documents." He read Dad's will aloud. It was surprisingly brief. "I leave all my personal effects and any assets not otherwise disposed of to my beloved wife, Carmen Sterling." Carmen practically glowed with triumph. Flores nodded with satisfaction, already calculating his percentage of what they believed was a multi-million-dollar inheritance. Then Walsh continued reading. "However, I must note that this will applies only to assets actually owned by Richard Sterling at the time of his death." He pulled out a thick folder that made Flores shift uncomfortably in his seat. In March 2019, Mr. Sterling established the Sterling Family Trust, an irrevocable trust transferring all major assets, Sterling Construction, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and bank accounts, to benefit his 3 children equally. Carmen's face went from flushed satisfaction to pale shock in seconds. Flores began frantically shuffling through papers, clearly realizing his carefully planned fraud was collapsing. The total value of trust assets is approximately $4.2 million, Walsh continued with professional detachment. Mrs. Sterling's inheritance under the will consists of personal effects, household furnishings, and one joint savings account containing $74,000. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the Persian carpet. Flores recovered first, launching into threats about contesting the trust's validity. This is completely unacceptable. Mrs. Sterling was Richard's wife. She has legitimate expectations of a substantial inheritance. Will prove undue influence, mental incapacity, whatever it takes. Walsh's response was measured and devastating. The trust was established 3 years ago when Mr. Sterling was in perfect physical and mental health. It's irrevocable and properly executed. Multiple psychiatric evaluations confirm his competency at the time of signing. Carmen finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. This is impossible. Richard would never cut me out like this. He loved me. I'm sure he did, Walsh replied gently. Which is why he left you the house and a comfortable savings account. But he also loved his children and wanted to ensure their financial security. That's when I decided to play my trump card. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, there's something else you should know about Carmen's legitimate expectations. I played the recording from the funeral reception, Carmen's own voice filling the conference room. Finally, those ungrateful brats get nothing. Richard might have loved them, but I made sure they won't see a penny of his money. Carmen's face turned scarlet as her own words continued. Tony handled everything perfectly. By the time Isabella and her siblings figure out what happened, the money will be safely offshore where they can't touch it. The room was dead silent except for Carmen's recorded voice describing her fraudulent conspiracy. When the recording ended, Flores was frantically whispering to Carmen about invoking the Fifth Amendment. This recording also mentions Tony's involvement and plans to flee to Costa Rica, I continued. I believe the district attorney's office would be very interested in investigating attempted estate fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Walsh leaned forward with interest. Ms. Sterling, are you saying there was an attempt to file fraudulent estate documents? I produced copies of the forged will that our private investigator had obtained through his contacts. Carmen and Mr. Flores here created a fake will leaving everything to Carmen, complete with forged signatures and stolen letterhead from your office. Flores immediately stood up, advising Carmen to leave and refused to answer any questions. But the damage was complete. We had recorded confessions, physical evidence of fraud, and documentation of a conspiracy to defraud Dad's estate. As they rushed toward the exit, Carmen turned back with desperate fury. You think you've won, but I'll fight this. Richard owed me more than $74,000 for what I put up with. Actually, I replied calmly, after we deduct the cost of investigating your fraud and the legal fees for prosecuting you, you'll be lucky to have anything left. The conference room door slammed behind them, leaving us alone with Walsh and the sweet silence of perfect justice. Dad's 3-year strategy had worked flawlessly. Carmen's greed had become the weapon of her own destruction. The aftermath of the will reading moved swiftly through the legal system. Within 48 hours, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office had opened a criminal investigation into Carmen's activities. The evidence we'd gathered, recorded confessions, forged documents, and a detailed conspiracy, made prosecution straightforward. Carmen and Antonio Flores were arrested 1 week later. She was charged with attempted fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and identity theft. Flores faced additional charges for practicing law without a license and multiple counts of document forgery. Both eventually pled guilty to avoid trial, though Carmen maintained she'd been emotionally manipulated by Flores. The court wasn't sympathetic. Carmen received 3 years in state prison and was ordered to pay full restitution for all legal costs associated with her crimes. Her $74,000 inheritance was entirely consumed by fines and legal fees, leaving her with nothing. Flores received 5 years and permanent disbarment from ever practicing law again. But the real justice came in seeing Dad's vision for his legacy fulfilled. The Sterling Family Trust distributed assets exactly according to his wishes. Amanda took over Sterling Construction and proved to have inherited Dad's business acumen along with his company. Under her leadership, the firm expanded into sustainable construction and green building technologies, honoring Dad's belief in innovation and environmental responsibility. Marcus continued managing construction projects while developing expertise in historic restoration. He's become one of California's premier specialists in preserving vintage buildings, work that Dad would have deeply respected. I used my portion of the inheritance to establish a specialized law practice focusing on elder abuse and estate fraud cases. The experience with Carmen opened my eyes to how common these crimes are and how vulnerable older adults can be to manipulation by people they trust. We also created the Richard and Grace Sterling Foundation, providing scholarships for first-generation college students from working-class families who want to pursue business or construction management degrees. Dad would have loved knowing his success was helping other families build better futures. 3 years after Dad's death, I received a letter forwarded through the prison system. Carmen had written from her cell, asking if I'd consider putting the past behind us and helping her get back on her feet after her release. She claimed she'd learned her lesson and just needed a fresh start. I didn't reply. Some lessons are too expensive to risk learning twice. Looking back, I'm amazed by Dad's foresight and strategic thinking. He saw Carmen's true nature from the beginning, but chose to handle the situation through careful legal planning rather than confrontation. He got the companionship he needed during his grieving years while protecting his children's inheritance from someone he knew couldn't be trusted. The recordings I made proved crucial not just as evidence, but as validation that our instincts about Carmen were correct. Trust but verify, as Dad always said about business deals. It turned out that principle applied to family relationships too. Carmen thought she'd married a lonely widower she could manipulate and control. Instead, she'd married a successful businessman who understood exactly what she was and planned accordingly. The inheritance trap she tried to set for Dad's children caught her instead. Today, Sterling Construction continues to thrive under Amanda's leadership. Marcus has opened his own restoration company. And my elder abuse practice helps other families avoid the predators who target vulnerable older adults. We learned that protecting family requires both love and strategy. Dad provided both in abundance. Carmen received exactly what Dad thought she deserved, enough to live comfortably for the few years she contributed to his happiness, but not enough to live extravagantly on money she hadn't earned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. Sometimes it's simply being smarter than the people trying to take advantage of you. Dad was definitely smarter than Carmen, 3 years smarter, as it turned out. The most satisfying part wasn't seeing Carmen's shock at the will reading or watching her get arrested. It was realizing that Dad had loved us enough to protect us before we even knew we needed protection. That's the difference between real family and people who marry into it for money. Real family plans for your future. Gold diggers plan for their own. Dad understood the difference, and he made sure we'd understand it too. In the end, Carmen's inheritance trap worked perfectly. She just trapped herself instead.